Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show that takes a complex topic, throws a mountain of research at it, and really digs out the crucial insights for you.
Yeah, think of it as your shortcut to getting seriously well-informed.
Packed with those aha moments and hopefully a little bit of humor to keep things interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Today we're diving deep into a book that has really changed the way a lot of people think about, well, accidents.
That's right. We're talking about There Are No Accidents, The True Story of Death and Injury in America by Jessie Singer.
And this deep dive is brought to you by Ben's Book Summaries. Okay, let's unpack this, shall we? The sheer scale of what we're talking about here is staggering.
It truly is. Singer starts by hitting you with a pretty significant statistic. Over 173,000 accidental deaths in the U.S. every year.
Wow.
To really let that sink in, that's more deaths than we see from stroke, Alzheimer's, diabetes, even suicide. It's a huge number.
And it's a number that kind of surprisingly doesn't often get the public attention you might expect, does it?
Not really, no.
And the way Singer puts it into perspective is quite impactful. She equates it to, what was it, like more than one fully loaded Boeing 747-400 crashing every single day.
Yeah, every day with no survivors.
Oh.
When you picture that kind of repeated catastrophe,
The relative silence around accidental deaths feels, well, noticeable. Very noticeable.
but it does make you wonder, why we don't have the same level of public awareness or research funding or even widespread memorials for accident victims compared to other major causes of death.
Yeah, things that have much stronger public presence and advocacy.
Exactly.
And when you consider what falls under the umbrella of accidents, it's a really wide range, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. We're talking about motor vehicle crashes, of course, but also things like falls, which are surprisingly common.
Right.
Poisonings from various substances, fires and burns, drownings, even firearm incidents, machinery-related deaths, and more. It's a very diverse list.
Such a broad category.
And this leads us to a central point Singer makes, which is about the language we use, specifically the word accident itself.
Right. Singer really questions this term. And she brings in the work of Susan P. Baker, an epidemiologist who was a real pioneer in injury prevention.
A key figure.
Baker, in her influential book, The Injury Fact Book, even used quotation marks around accident. Why is that framing so important?
Well, what's fascinating here is Baker's underlying point. The word accident isn't neutral. It carries this implication of randomness, of something that couldn't have been foreseen or prevented.
Like it just happened by chance.
Exactly. And that idea actually hinders our ability to look deeper at the factors involved and to recognize that many of these events are, in fact, quite predictable and preventable.
So by calling something an accident, we might inadvertently be accepting it as just bad luck instead of looking for ways to stop it.
Precisely. And this isn't just, a semantic debate. Singer points out that in the public health field, there's a growing shift away from using accident.
Towards what?
Towards more precise terms like unintentional injury or just naming the event like motor vehicle collision or fall from a height. This change in language reflects a fundamental change in thinking, moving from the idea of chance to the investigation of causes.
Which naturally leads to the question of what we're actually doing to prevent these unintentional injuries. The book suggests our resources aren't necessarily aligned with the problem.
That's a critical point. Singer highlights a significant imbalance in research funding at the NIH, the National Institutes of Health.
Right, the main federal research agency.
Yeah. When it comes to preventing diseases versus preventing accidents or unintentional injuries, she cites a compelling example from 2006.
Oh, where's that?
When you look at the billions NIH granted for research into the 29 leading causes of death, injury prevention received disproportionately less funding compared to its actual impact, like its burden of illness.
Less funding even though it causes so many deaths.
Yes. Only research into depression was funded at a lower relative level back then.
Wow. That's surprising when you consider the sheer number of deaths.
Yeah.
We're investing heavily in diseases, which is crucial, obviously.
Of course.
But something claiming even more lives seems to be getting comparatively less attention.
Exactly. And it gets more concerning. Singer notes that between 1996 and 2006, a period when accidental deaths were actually increasing. NIH funding for research specifically focused on injury-related deaths actually decreased by over $500 $1 billion.
Decreased while deaths were rising. That seems counterintuitive.
It does. It wasn't really until the opioid crisis became such a major public health emergency that we saw a significant increase in government funding for research into accidental overdose.
Okay, so that specific area got a boost.
It did. But even with that increased focus, the overall funding landscape for injury prevention remained uneven as of 2019.
Still lagging behind.
That's right. In 2019, research into injuries still received less than half the funding allocated to studying conditions like HIV/AIDS, dementia, or Alzheimer's.
Even though injuries caused more deaths and lost years of life.
Correct. According to Singer's analysis, it really points to a systemic undervaluation of preventing these so-called accidents.
And it's not just about the human cost, is it? The book also details the enormous economic burden.
Oh, the financial impact is truly staggering. In 2019 alone, accidental fatalities and injuries cost the United States an estimated $1.09 trillion.
$1 trillion. What does that even include?
It includes a whole range of expenses: lost wages, medical expenses, property damage from crashes and fires, insurance costs, rising premiums, the works.
And that $1 trillion figure.
Okay.
That's just the immediate direct costs, isn't it?
Yeah.
The book mentions longer-term consequences, too.
Exactly. When people survive accidents but are left with permanent disabilities or reduced quality of life, that adds an estimated additional $4.5 trillion annually to the total economic burden.
So combined,
Yeah.
we're talking well over $5.5 trillion every year. That's astronomical.
It is.
That breaks down to a direct cost of roughly $2,800 per year for every single person in the U.S.
Right. That's a significant amount ultimately coming out of our pockets in various ways.
Yeah.
And Singer makes a really important observation here, because the majority of these costs are borne by taxpayers.
Rathered, say, by the corporations whose products or practices might contribute to these accidents, there can be a perverse incentive.
How so?
Allowing accidents to happen, even those from unsafe products or poorly regulated workplaces, can actually be, well, financially advantageous for some corporations, which is a pretty unsettling thought.
It really highlights a potential conflict of interest. Those who could implement safety measures might not have the strongest financial motivation to do so. Now, the book introduces two contrasting ways of understanding why accidents happen: the bad apple theory and the new view. Can you break down the difference?
Certainly. The bad apple theory is the, let's say, the traditional way of thinking. It focuses on identifying the individual who made a mistake or error.
Find the person to blame.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah?
The assumption is if you find the person responsible, hold them accountable, you've solved the problem, prevented it from happening again.
So it's about removing the bad apple from the barrel. Precisely. The new view, on the other hand, offers a fundamentally different perspective. It argues that instead of just focusing on individual errors, we should be examining the systemic conditions and environmental factors that create the opportunity for those errors to occur and escalate.
Okay.
The idea is, look, humans will inevitably make mistakes, so we need to design systems and environments that are more resilient to those errors, that prevent them from causing serious harm.
And the examples Singer uses really clarify this, like the difference between firing a worker who slipped versus fixing the slippery floor.
Exactly. Or instead of just punishing a driver after a crash at a dangerous intersection, you redesign the intersection to make it safer for everyone.
Got it.
And as Singer emphasizes, which approach we take has huge consequences for whether similar incidents happen again. Blaming individuals often lets the systemic issues slide.
Right. Now, the book digs into the history of how we understand accidents, and the shift in how we saw traffic accidents in the early 20th century is a really illuminating example of this blame shift.
It really is. Singer recounts how in the early days of cars, fatal traffic incidents were often met with intense public outrage, almost seen as acts of car murder.
Car murder, wow.
Yeah, there are documenting cases of angry crowds attacking drivers involved in fatal accidents. Historian Peter Norton noted organizations like the City Club of New York even published municipal murder maps in the 1920s showing child traffic fatalities.
It's almost unimaginable today, that level of fury directed at drivers after an accident. What changed?
Well, that's where a strategic, well-funded campaign by automakers and their allies comes in. They realized this perception of cars as inherently dangerous was bad for business.
Makes sense.
So they launched a deliberate effort to redirect the blame away from the cars themselves and onto human error.
And the creation and popularization of the term jaywalking is a key example of this, right? That's one of those vignettes people remember from the book.
Absolutely. Singer details how the auto lobby actively promoted jaywalking. turning what used to be the driver's responsibility yielding to pedestrians into a pedestrian crime.
So they basically invented a crime for pedestrians.
Pretty much. They used media campaigns, influenced traffic laws to criminalize crossing outside crosswalks. Before that, the responsibility was largely on the person operating the dangerous machine.
But they successfully shifted it.
They did. Today, every state has laws against jaywalking, and if a pedestrian is hit outside a crosswalk, they're almost always deemed at fault.
That's a powerful example of how language and laws can shape blame. And Singer connects this to the modern focus on distracted pedestrians.
She does. As pedestrian deaths rose again recently, there's been a lot of talk about distracted walking people on phones being the problem. Ford even tried to push the term petextrian.
Petextrian, seriously.
Seriously. But Singer points out surveys of transportation officials showed a wildly inflated perception of distracted walking's role. The actual data, it's a relatively minor factor.
So it's like history repeating itself, blaming the victim again.
It mirrors the earlier campaign, yeah. Just updated for the smartphone age.
And she makes that really interesting comparison to the gun lobby's slogan, guns don't kill people, people kill people.
Highlighting it as another example of deflecting responsibility from a product onto individual behavior. It's a quote that definitely sticks with people.
It's a powerful analogy. And it's clearly been effective for cars. Like Singer says, we report traffic accidents like the weather now, not with the outrage of the past.
That normalization shows the success of the blame-shifting campaign. It's a key takeaway how our understanding can be actively shaped.
It really makes you think about how ingrained this idea of individual responsibility has become. And the book also tackles another myth, the accident-prone individual.
Yes, another long-held belief Singer debunks. Early industrial psychology tried hard to identify workers supposedly prone to accidents due to personality or moral failings.
Like what?
Oh, studies linking low religious values in pilots to accidents, or suggesting mentally subnormal drivers crashed more, guilt complexes in miners, undesirable traits in taxi drivers. It sounds pretty wild now.
It does sound quite pseudoscientific, but it was taken seriously.
It was, and Singer shares a great anecdote about Georgia Pacific executives. When accidents spiked in their plants around 2012, they concluded workers weren't embracing our policies fully enough. Their solution: demand stricter rule following.
So just blame the workers. Again.
Exactly. But Singer points out the reality was the company had increased workload and pressure on fewer employees. Conditions were ripe for mistakes.
The system was the problem.
Right. But the execs didn't want to consider lower profits or slower production for safety. Blaming bad Apple workers let them avoid fixing the systemic issues they controlled.
It really underscores that key takeaway. Focusing on individual flaws distracts from the bigger picture.
Definitely. It diverts attention from workplace safety context and employer responsibilities, which leads into the powerful concept of social autopsies.
Right. Tell me about that.
Singer uses historian Bryant Simon's work on the tragic Hamlet fire. Imperial Foods chicken plant, North Carolina, 1991. 25 workers died.
I remember hearing about that. Awful.
Simon did a deep dive, a social autopsy. He found the owners had deliberately avoided OSHA up north, moved south to dodge regulations, and built in a black neighborhood with a vulnerable workforce.
So the fire wasn't just a random event.
Not at all. Simon showed it was a predictable outcome of cheap food, cheap government, cheap lives. Driven by owners' choices to prioritize profit over safety, avoid oversight, exploit workers. The Hamlet fire story is a really powerful vignette in the book.
And there were conflicting stories about why the doors were locked. That's another disturbing detail.
Yes, the official story focused on owner greed, but a disturbing rumor persisted. Doors locked to prevent worker theft. Echoes of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire.
Wow. Whether true or not, it shows the mindset.
It does, and Singer contrasts the community responses. The white community often saw it as a tragic anomaly.
And the black community.
In the black church, it was seen as an assault, sadly predictable given the history of exploitation. Reverend Jessie Jackson called for systemic change, not just mourning an accident.
That difference in perspective is huge. It shows how our social position shapes how we see these events.
Exactly. How we frame it influences if we demand real change. Now, shifting slightly, the book talks about a common psychological bias. The fundamental attribution error.
Okay, what's that?
It's key to why we often blame individuals. It's our tendency to attribute our own actions to the situation or environment,
Uh-huh.
but attribute other people's actions to their personality or errors, even when the situation clearly played a role.
And you shared a personal story in the book that illustrates this.
I did. About almost falling off a cliff as a kid. My parents later told me how close it was, and Singer points out, hearing that, you might think about my recklessness or my mom's supervision human error,
Right.
but that focus ignores the fact there was a dangerous cliff with an inadequate guardrail, a hazardous condition that could have been fixed. It's a relatable way to see how quickly we jump to blaming the person.
It really highlights how we blame the person and overlook the environment's role. And Singer makes it clear the book focuses mostly on the built environment for prevention, right?
That's right. While accidents happen in nature, she concentrates on our roads, homes, workplaces, because that's where most happen and where they are most directly preventable through changing the built environment. That focus is key to the new view.
Okay. Now, the book also examines the powerful role of regulation and unions in improving safety. The Railroad Safety Appliance Act example is compelling.
It truly is. Given the railroad's power back then, it's amazing that act passed, mandating automatic couplers and air brakes.
Yeah, dangerous work before that.
Incredibly. A Harper's editor, Riley, noted, as long as brakes cost more than a trained man's life, manual coupling would likely persist. Shows the tension between profit and safety.
But regulation forced their hand.
Yes, it compelled the industry to adopt safer tech. They embraced automatic couplers and air brakes. It shows how regulation can drive safety, even if it seems costly initially. A key takeaway on regulation's power.
And Crystal Eastman's work in the early 20th century challenged the careless worker idea directly.
Absolutely. Her sociological study in Pittsburgh was pioneering. She documented the high rates of industrial deaths and injuries and gathered data refuting the corporate narrative of worker blame.
So she showed it was the conditions.
Compellingly, yes. It was the inherently dangerous conditions, not worker flaws, driving the accidents. Her work was foundational.
And she also showed the devastating economic impact on families.
She did. Before workers' comp, families got little or nothing if a worker was killed or injured, barely funeral costs. This stark reality helped build support for workers' compensation laws.
Which shifted the financial burden to employers.
Exactly. And that created a powerful incentive to improve safety.
And did it work? Did safety improve?
Dramatically. Once employers had to pay for injuries, they worked to reduce them. Deaths per hour worked fell by 2/3 in the 2 decades after workers' comp became widespread. A clear example of incentives driving safety.
But even with those laws, unions remained important for enforcement.
Absolutely. Laws are one thing, making sure they're followed on the ground is another. Strong unions were vital. Singer notes injuries started rising again after the 1950s, coinciding with weaker unions.
Which eventually led to OSHA.
Right. That increase contributed to passing the Occupational Safety and Health Act in 1970, the first comprehensive federal regulation of workplace safety. Shows the ongoing need for advocacy.
Okay, now shifting to a larger scale, the book introduces theories for understanding major disasters, like Reason's Swiss cheese model and Perot's normal accident theory. Can you explain those?
Sure. Reason's Swiss cheese model is a useful visual. Imagine stacked slices of Swiss cheese, each slice a safety barrier, but every slice has holes, weaknesses, flaws, errors. An accident happens when, rarely, the holes in all the slices line up, creating a path for failure to cascade through the defenses. So it's usually multiple small failures aligning.
So even multiple safeguards can fail if the holes line up. What about Perot's normal accident theory? That sounds more pessimistic.
It is. Perot argues that in certain highly complex and tightly coupled systems, big accidents are essentially inevitable over time, no matter the safeguards.
What does tightly coupled mean exactly?
It means the parts are highly interdependent. A failure in one part quickly triggers failures elsewhere with little buffer time. Think of a nuclear power plant very tightly coupled.
Okay.
Contrast that with maybe a factory assembly line more loosely coupled. A fire in one spot might be contained without causing a plant-wide chain reaction.
And 3 Mile Island is an example supporting Perot's theory.
It is. Perot argued the meltdown wasn't just a few human errors, but a result of the system's inherent complexity and tight coupling. Multiple technical issues and confusing signals interacted unexpectedly, overwhelming operators and safety systems.
And Singer also points out the unseen long-term consequences of big accidents can be huge.
Absolutely. She uses the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Beyond the visible slick, research found a much larger plume of dispersed oil deep underwater, potentially devastating plankton the base of the food chain. shows the cascading, lasting effects we might not see right away.
A sobering reminder of the true, far-reaching impact. Now, the book also delves into risk perception, how our biases make us underestimate some dangers and overestimate others.
Yes, Singer discusses Paul Sluvic's work. Factors like feeling in control and perceived benefits heavily influence our risk assessment. We underestimate driving risks because we feel in control and value the convenience.
Right, makes sense.
Similarly, the perceived security from owning a gun might lead some to underestimate the risks involved.
And other factors skew our perception too, like dread, or if it's man-made versus natural.
Exactly. Risks evoking dread, like plane crashes, feel riskier than common dangers like car travel. Man-made risks, like nuclear power, often feel more threatening than natural disasters with similar impact, like earthquakes.
What else?
Risks imposed on us, risks involving children, novel risks, heavily publicized risks, all tend to be perceived as much riskier than voluntary or familiar ones.
Which explains why public outcry is stronger for some accidents, even if they're statistically rarer.
Precisely.
Now, the book takes a critical look at fields like traffic engineering, suggesting their practices might actually contribute to the problem. That might surprise some people.
It's an eye-opening section. Singer quotes Eric Dumbaugh, who argues traffic engineering in the U.S. operates almost as a fraud discipline.
Wow, strong words. Why?
He contends many design guidelines aren't based on current safety research, are misapplied, and are partly a legacy of automakers shifting blame onto drivers, not fixing inherent road dangers.
So, how does road design make things more hazardous?
Dumbaugh's research suggests designing roads like highways straight, wide, clear of obstructions actually encourages speeding.
Really, removing things makes it less safe.
Paradoxically, yes. Things engineers often remove for safety, gentle curves, roadside trees, benches can actually calm traffic, making drivers slow down naturally. Without those cues, drivers feel less risk and speed up, increasing accident likelihood and severity.
And even how speed limits are set isn't always purely about safety.
That's right. Dumbaugh explains guidelines factor in traffic flow, economic development, even politics, like convenient access to a Walmart.
So, convenience over safety sometimes.
The balancing of priorities can result in limits higher than the safest possible speed for that road.
A critical and unsettling perspective on our roads. The book also highlights how corporations often blame human error in product liability cases, even with evidence of design flaws. Back to the bad apple theory.
The Sig Sauer P320 pistol example illustrates this. Numerous reports of it firing unintentionally while holstered. Yet the company largely blamed negligent trigger pulls by users, even trained police officers.
But the book suggests a design flaw might be the real issue.
Exactly. Firearms experts quoted argue the striker-fire design might make it prone to accidental discharge if there's a mechanical issue. Repeated incidents across users suggest a systemic problem, not just isolated errors.
So calling it human error protects the company.
It deflects liability and avoids addressing potential product defects. The book also examines systemic risks in accidental drug poisoning, where focus often falls on individual responsibility.
Like the story of baby Maisie.
Yes, the heartbreaking story of her accidental methadone ingestion. While the focus might naturally be on parental responsibility, the book highlights broader vulnerabilities in how drugs like methadone are distributed, packaged, regulated.
And the slow government response to the opioid epidemic overall.
Right. It underscores that even when individual errors happen, the system should have safeguards to prevent fatal consequences. The system should be robust enough to absorb human mistakes.
And the book delves into the powerful role of social stigma in accidental drug deaths.
That's a really important aspect. Stigma, Singer argues, is a fundamental cause of health disparities here. It influences who's labeled an abuser versus a patient, even in cases of accidental addiction from prescriptions.
And research shows we have less empathy for stigmatized individuals.
Yes, less empathy even for their physical pain, like AIDS patients who contracted it via drug use. This stigma has deadly consequences.
How does it create tangible barriers?
It impacts access to life-saving treatments like naloxone for overdoses. Studies show it's often unavailable, unaffordable, or pharmacists are reluctant to dispense it, even where illegal over the counter. This reluctance stems from stigma.
A clear link between stigma and fatal outcomes. And the book connects drug use stigma with Racial stigma.
Yes, crucially. Before the opioid epidemic hit white communities hard via prescriptions, overdoses disproportionately affected black communities, largely due to criminalization rather than medical treatment.
So different responses based on race.
Very different. When prescription opioids drove overdoses among white people, the narrative shifted somewhat. But now, as the crisis involves illicit opioids, black overdose rates are rising again, yet access to treatment like buprenorphine remains skewed towards white individuals.
It starkly shows how biases shape who's seen as a victim versus who's blamed or criminalized.
Exactly. Which leads to the broader point about racism itself as a systemic cause of accidents.
This is critical. Accidents don't happen equally across racial lines.
No, they don't. Indigenous and black infants have higher accidental death rates, possibly linked to biased medical diagnoses. Even categories like SIDs versus accidental suffocation show racial disparities in application.
And this extends beyond medical settings.
Yes. Enforcement of minor infractions like jaywalking is often biased. Black pedestrians are stopped and ticketed far more often than white pedestrians for the same behavior. And studies show bias in threat perception. Simulated police scenarios show a greater likelihood of perceiving a weapon and using force against black individuals, even when unarmed.
The book also highlights disparities in housing and occupational deaths.
Yes. Black individuals are twice as likely to die in house fires, linked to housing conditions, lack of smoke detectors and rentals, flammable materials.
And at work.
Black men historically face higher fatal injury risks than white men in the same jobs due to more dangerous tasks, less safety gear, worse conditions. Plus, environmental racism, disproportionate exposure of people of color to toxic facilities increases risk. And this trend is worsening.
So racism isn't just prejudice. It's embedded in systems that shape our environment and risk. Now, what about the public's understanding of the word accident?
Dr. Deborah Jurasek's 1999 survey found most people see accidents as preventable but unpredictable, but strongly agree they are not done on purpose.
Focus on lack of intent.
Right. Jurasek theorizes this comes from focusing on single tragedies, not population data. Considering intent reinforces looking for individual error.
And this might reinforce overlooking systemic factors. The book then explores the roles of poverty and inequality.
A critical dimension. The U.S. counties with the highest accidental death rates are overwhelmingly majority indigenous areas with extreme poverty and poor infrastructure.
And the agencies serving them are underfunded.
Often, yes. Bureau of Indian Affairs, Indian Health Service, frequently underfunded and mismanaged, affecting healthcare, road safety, everything.
And this isn't just an indigenous issue, it's broader economic inequality.
Absolutely. Infrastructure investment has declined nationwide. Bridges, water mains, levees are aging. A Brown University study found strong links between both individual and community poverty and higher accidental death rates.
And the gap is widening.
Yes, alarmingly. Poorer people in poorer places face the highest risk. The book even notes increased opioid deaths after auto factory shutdowns, linking economic hardship to risk. Economic factors are deeply intertwined.
Wealth acts as a risk insulator, a buffer, which connects to the just world fallacy.
Yes, that cognitive bias where we believe the world is fair and people get what they deserve.
How does that play out with accidents?
Witnessing misfortune. This bias leads us to blame the victim to maintain our belief in a fair world. It avoids confronting random chance, systemic failures, inequality. Makes it harder to see the real causes.
And harder to advocate for systemic change. The book also looks at how blame and conformity play out after accidents, like with Allison Leal's death.
A disturbing case. 4-year-old Allison killed by a driver in Queens. Eyewitnesses, media, police quickly formed a narrative blaming the child and grandmother, despite later contradictory evidence.
Why the rush to blame them?
Singer suggests possible unconscious identification with the driver, what if that was me, fueling the blame. Highlights how initial perceptions and biases shape the story.
Our own biases influence blame, even as observers. And experiments show perspective matters, like body cam versus dash cam views.
Exactly. Viewpoint shapes perceived intent. Raquel Nelson's story is another powerful example of misplaced blame.
Tell me about that one.
Her son AJ was killed crossing a highway near their Atlanta bus stop. No crosswalk, no signal where people had to cross for the bus.
Dangerous conditions.
Clearly. Yet, initial blame focused on her for not using a non-existent crosswalk, not the lack of safe infrastructure. This, despite pedestrian accidents being common near Atlanta bus, stops a known systemic risk.
It powerfully shows the need to focus on dangerous conditions, not just individual errors.
Precisely, which leads to the critique of focusing solely on individual protection, like bicycle helmets.
Right. Helmets help, but the book argues the focus is often misplaced.
Yes, intense focus on helmets often distracts from the bigger need. Safer infrastructure like separated bike lanes, mandatory helmet laws might even discourage cycling.
And cities with high cycling rates but lower helmet use often have lower overall fatality rates.
Often, yes. The fixation on helmets can become a way to blame cyclists and avoid addressing the danger from cars and lack of safe infrastructure. Some researchers call it a moralizing tone to avoid fixing the real problem.
So if not just individual gear, what should the priority be? The book argues for addressing systemic conditions.
Exactly. Singer highlights early work by Jones and Fitz post-WWII, linking pilot errors to poor cockpit design. A revolutionary insight. Design influences error.
And Sidney Dekker continued this new view.
Yes, emphasizing that blaming human error preserves the status quo and leads to repeat accidents. We need to understand the systemic failures that let errors become catastrophes, like the missing crosswalk for Raquel Nelson, or poor cockpit design, the holes in the Swiss cheese aligning.
Applying this new view is crucial for prevention. The book gives examples.
Absolutely. Eric Nang's death falling from a path with bad barriers, despite prior incidents. Activists documented the history and pushed for permanent barriers, recognizing the systemic failure.
And tragically, this IPOV truck attack later happened on the same path.
Yes, highlighting the same vulnerability vehicles in poorly protected pedestrian areas. Singer introduces William Haddon's countermeasures, controlling energy pre-event, bollards, during event, crumple zones, post-event, EMS response.
Like Portugal's drug decriminalization.
A great example of Haddon's principles. Focusing on harm reduction, reduced overdoses, and HIV, rather than just blaming users. Susan Baker's quote captures it. "If you make this world safe for drunks, you make it safe for everybody. Design for human fallibility."
Instead of the U.S. tendency to design for perfect people and blame victims when things go wrong, like with rising pedestrian deaths.
Exactly. Which contrasts with Sweden's Vision Zero.
Explain Vision Zero again.
It's a paradigm shift. Goal: zero traffic deaths. Responsibility shifts from individuals to government and engineers to design inherently safe systems that anticipate human error and prevent severe consequences. Prevent harm from inevitable mistakes, don't just blame after. A key takeaway for rethinking road safety.
But the book also notes a trend of weakening accountability systems meant to prevent accidents and hold corporations responsible.
Yes, government regulations and tort law are critical for accountability. But Singer sees a trend of anti-regulatory ideology. Fewer tort lawsuits, lower awards. These systems are being eroded.
Making it harder to hold powerful entities responsible.
Correct. And corporations actively work to undermine them.
Even as new tech, like autonomous vehicles, emerges, often without enough regulation.
The Elaine Herzberg death by a self-driving Uber highlights the regulatory gaps at the time. And AV makers lobby hard to be exempt from safety standards.
Deregulation trends since the 80s also play a role, prioritizing economics over safety.
Yes. Reagan-era cost-benefit analysis put a monetary value on life, often finding safety regulations too expensive. Amit Narang argues many accidents are actually choices born of greed, corporations prioritizing profit over safety compliance.
And groups like ALICE actively push laws to limit corporate liability.
That's correct. ALICE promotes model legislation in states to limit liability, comparative fault acts, caps on damages. These bills often pass, further weakening accountability.
In contrast to blame and limited liability, the book suggests restorative justice as an alternative.
Yes, a different framework.
Right.
Focuses on dialogue between victims and responsible parties to foster understanding, apology, accountability, and repair harm, prevent future incidents.
Like the story of the mother meeting the driver who killed her son.
A powerful anecdote showing the potential for healing and closure through this approach. It's more human-centered.
The book concludes with a call to remember victims and demand systemic change.
Yes, using stories like Edgar Torres and the Cohen-Kodak family to show the enduring pain and anger. Singer argues love and rage must drive change.
So bringing it all together, what's the most important key takeaway for our listeners from this deep dive into there are no accidents?
The fundamental takeaway is that accidents are often not random. They're predictable, preventable outcomes of systemic failures, dangerous conditions, societal inequalities, rarely just individual error. So we must look beyond human error to the deeper root causes.
And that shift starts with being mindful of the language we use.
Absolutely. Question the word accident. Ask how and why. Has it happened before? What systemic factors contributed? This critical thinking moves us beyond accepting these events as inevitable.
towards building a safer, more equitable society. By shifting perspective and asking those key questions, there's been a deep dive into There Are No Accidents by Jessie.
A really thought-provoking book.
Remember, this deep dive was brought to you by Ben's Book Summaries. Thanks for joining us.